Thank you, Liam, for the generous introduction, and Catherine Day for organising everything that there was to do with this event. I'm not sure about you, but when I watched Donald Trump take the oath on January the 20th, I just kept thinking there's something wrong here. There's something very wrong, and I couldn't quite work out what it was. And it was something beyond just the politics. And then I thought it might be my TV screen because he was so orange, and it became particularly clear when he raised his hand, which had clearly not been in the tanning bed, and you saw the contrast. And then I kind of fast forwarded to the next couple of days and the alternative truths and imagined Sean Spicer, his press person, insisting that he was in fact the second president of color ever to occupy the White House, and that orange really is the new black. I want to start with a reference to an episode of The Office where David Brent wistfully recalls a tender moment during his favorite film, The Dam Busters, involving the hero pilot Wing Commander Guy Gibson. Before he goes into battle, says Brent, he's playing with his dog. And then Brent's sidekick Gareth says, his dog's called Nigger, recalling with glee the name of the dog. And Brent flinches, eager to mitigate the slur, and he says, yeah, but it was the 40s. That's before racism was bad. To watch Donald Trump both campaign and govern is to see America regress to a time before many people thought racism was bad. When you could say what you want, when no filters were necessary, when political correctness hadn't ruined everything, when America was great. He's thanked African Americans for not voting, questioned the right of Latinos to vote, branded Mexicans rapists, Muslims terrorists, the Chinese cheats, and used every coded conspiracy word out there for Jews, from international bankers to stewards of global government. When it comes to racist rhetoric, it's like the civil rights movement and all that emerged from it never happened. Now, I want a word of caution at the beginning of this talk, because in this moment, the easiest thing for liberals to do would be to succumb to nostalgia and revel in ridicule, to reminisce about how things have taken a turn for the worse since Donald Trump was elected and lampoon our adversaries. Who can resist poking fun at Sean Spicer, insisting this was the biggest inauguration crowd ever? Trump congratulating Frederick Douglass without realizing he's dead, and Kellyanne Conway inventing terrorist attacks that never happened and then blaming the media for not reporting them. But all this does is really virtue signal our indignation. It takes no great effort to oppose Trump. He's a thin-skinned charlatan, a self-proclaimed sexual harasser, a blusterer, and a bigot. One need not exhaust any moral energy in making a case against his racial politics. One need expend no great amount of political capital attacking him. George W. Bush opposed him. Glenn Beck opposed him. What's far more difficult, where his racial politics is concerned, is to understand the forces that produced him and the appeal that propelled him. And for this, it's worthwhile starting with Barack Obama, because there is a connection between the new normal and the old that must be understood if resistance in the Trump era is going to amount to more than Twitter memes driven by impotent rage. This transition has not been simply a matter of sequence, one bad president following a good one, but consequence, one's horrendous agenda facilitated by the weaknesses of its predecessor. It's as easy for liberals to despise Trump as it is for them to love Obama. Obama is measured, thoughtful, smart, and eloquent. He did some good things despite strong opposition from Republicans. He surfed into power on a wave of post-racial delusion. I was in South Carolina the night he won his primary there against Hillary Clinton. South Carolina is the first state to form the Confederacy and was the last to fly the Confederate flag. And as his victory was announced, crowds chanted, "Race doesn't matter." Before his presidency was out, a white supremacist had walked into a black church in the state and shot dead 9 people and injured 3. Race still mattered. Indeed, it was one of the central contradictions of Obama's ascent to power that just as people were saying the elevation of this one man signaled racial progress, black Americans were losing more than a generation of wealth in the financial crisis. By the time Obama left office, the gap between black and white wealth had grown, black poverty had increased, and the gap between black and white employment had remained the same. Meanwhile, a major popular eruption against police brutality, Black Lives Matter, had emerged with almost no reference to Obama at all. As such, his relationship to some of the key issues surrounding black life was almost ornamental. He was the framed poster in the barbershop or the nail salon, the mural on the underpass, the picture in the diner or the bodega, an inspiration not to be mistaken for the attrition of daily life. The question as to whether America can elect a black president has been answered, but the issue of the sanctity of black life has yet to be settled. There was one telling poll that showed that white Americans were more likely to be willing to vote for a black president than they were to be happy at having a black neighbor. Symbolically, he has meant a great deal. Substantially, much of what changed racially has in fact changed for the worst. Now, reasonable people can argue about the degree to which Obama as one man was responsible for any of this, but they cannot dispute the fact of it. When the first black president left office, racial tensions and racial discrepancies were greater than when he entered it. And this distinction between symbols and substance was exemplified the week before Trump's inauguration. To celebrate its 225th anniversary, the US Mint and Treasury unveiled plans to issue a 24-carat commemorative coin depicting Lady Liberty as an African-American woman. With full lips and braided hair tied back in a bun, her gold-embossed profile was framed by the words "Liberty" above and "In God We Trust" below. Elisa Basnet, the Mint's chief of staff, said, "As we as a nation continue to evolve, so does Liberty's representation." Sadly, the representation was evolving far faster than the nation. The coin was worth $100. In 2010, the median net wealth for women of color was calculated at just $5. Black women now earn 65 cents for every $1 made by a white man, the same gap as 20 years ago. So the Treasury had produced a coin in these women's image that these very women could not afford, because the economy is producing low-wage jobs that leave them with abstract liberty but without actual equality. But alongside the issue of what Obama did, there was what he was. For his supporters, he represented America's promise, the child of a mixed-race relationship, the father in an intact black family, the son of an immigrant, a global citizen with class mobility. But to his detractors, all of these things were an illustration of something quite different that helps explain Trump in this racial moment. For some people put so much of the right-wing animus down to Obama being black, but that has always seemed to me far too limited an understanding of the range of pathologies and vulnerabilities at play. Obama came to embody the anxieties of a significant section of white America. He was the son of a Kenyan immigrant at a moment when America was struggling to come to terms with the impact of immigration and foreign trade. 72% of Republicans last year still doubted that Obama was an American citizen. He's the son of a non-observant Muslim who came to power as the country was losing wars in predominantly Muslim lands. A majority of Republicans last year still believed Obama was a Muslim. He was a product of a mixed-race relationship at a time when one of the fastest-growing racial groups in the nation is those who identify as more than one race. He was a non-white president who ended his term at a time when the majority of children under 5 in America were not white. The southern border is porous, and black people are out on the streets again demanding equality before the law. Abroad, jihadi terrorists are becoming ever more brazen and brutal in their attacks on Western cities and civilians. The Chinese economy will soon be larger than America's. The US military has failed to deliver victory in several Muslim countries, and refugees are desperately fleeing the Middle East. Add to all of that stagnant wages, falling living standards, decreasing life expectancy for white women, and vanishing class mobility, and you can see how demographically and geopolitically being a white American does not feel like it used to. Obama became a proxy for those who could not accept that decline and who understood his very presence both as a threat and a humiliation. Trump, in many ways, has been their response. Now, Trump did not introduce racism to the modern Republican Party in particular, or the American polity in general. It is an enduring and inescapable feature of its working. The Democrats, once that peculiar coalition of Southern planters and Northern liberals, originally were the primary opponents of civil rights legislation. Then came LBJ, who passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. The veteran journalist Bill Moyers wrote that the night Johnson passed that act, he was euphoric. But, and now I quote Moyers, late that very night, I found him in a melancholy mood as he lay in bed reading the Bulldog edition of the Washington Post with headlines celebrating the day. I asked him what was troubling him. I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party for a long time to come, he said. Republicans were making the same calculation. If they could reposition themselves away from being the party of Lincoln that freed the slaves and towards the party of white America and racial privilege, they could create a new and expanded base that included Southern and suburban whites alongside industrialists and small government conservatives. This became known as Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, which deployed a coded racial message that could bind together a formidable coalition of Southern states and suburban white voters. Nixon told his chief of staff, Bob Haldeman, once, "You have to face the fact that the whole problem is really the blacks. The key is to devise a system that recognizes that while not appearing to." Describing the evolution of the Republicans' racial appeal, the late Lee Atwater, one-time chair of the Republican National Committee and a member of the Reagan administration, said in 1981, you start out in 1954, that's the year that Brown versus Board of Education was passed, ushering in desegregation. You start in 1954 by saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 68, you can't say nigger because that hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing and states' rights. And you're getting so abstract now that you're talking about cutting taxes, and all these things you're talking about are totally economic things. And a byproduct of them is that blacks get hurt worse than whites. Now, obviously, sitting around saying we want to cut this is much more abstract than even the busing thing, and a hell of a lot more abstract than just nigger, nigger. The codes weren't particularly sophisticated, but they contained at least plausible deniability. In 1980, Reagan kicked off his post-convention campaign at the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi, talking about states' rights, the Confederate rallying cry, not far from where 3 civil rights workers were murdered by racists in 1964. In 1988, George Bush Sr. ran the Willie Horton ad, a black murder convict who raped a Maryland woman and stabbed her companion while on weekend release to shame his opponent. In 1992, Bill Clinton flew back home to Arkansas during the campaign to oversee the execution of a black inmate, Ricky Ray Rector, an effectively lobotomized man so mentally incapacitated that when given his last meal, he opted to save the dessert for after. George Bush Jr. gave a speech at Bob Jones University in South Carolina, which at the time upheld a ban on interracial dating. For a long time, all this worked. But as the nation looked ahead to a none too distant future when white people would no longer be a majority, these appeals became ever more shrill. Since 1980, the white share of the electorate has fallen in every consecutive election bar one, 1996, when Ross Perot ran. And the more black and Latino voters the Republicans alienate, the more white voters they need to replace them. Every month, 50,000 new Latinos become voters, or Latinos become new voters, I should say. The trouble, therefore, is that the Republicans are fishing for a larger number in a smaller pool, which demands ever more juicy bait. Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina acknowledged the problem, saying, "We are losing the demographics race badly. We're not generating enough angry white guys to stay in business for the long term." But that hasn't stopped them trying. During the 2012 primaries, Rick Santorum was asked a question about foreign influence in the economy. As he meandered incoherently through his answer, he came out with this gem: "I don't want to make black people's lives better by giving them somebody else's money. I want to give them the opportunity to go out and earn the money." "Right," said one audience member as another woman nodded. And provide for themselves and their families," he added to applause. Just a few days later in Plymouth, New Hampshire, it's two of the whitest states in the Union, Newt Gingrich told a crowd, "I will go to the NAACP convention." The NAACP is the oldest civil rights organization in America, "and explain to the African American community why they should demand paychecks instead of food stamps." They called Obama the food stamp president. Both at different moments mounted serious challenges to Mitt Romney, who himself called for the voluntary repatriation of illegal immigrants. At the convention that year, one man threw peanuts at a black camerawoman, shouting, "This is how we treat the animals." So for a while now, it's been as though Republicans who might be put off by racist rhetoric were in short supply, as though the presence of a black president has left them blind to their own sophism. No candidates' polling numbers nosedived after those remarks. There was precious little in the way of a mainstream media frenzy. As recently as 2006, when in Virginia, George Allen called a young videographer macaca, and that cost him his Senate seat, there was a time when making racist statements would have cost you, and that time has passed. There's no passing these statements, they are what they are. We are back to the days when conservatives feel comfortable calling a spade a spade. Some commentators have described it as a dog whistle, a call set to a tone that rallies some without disturbing others, a special frequency for the inducted. But this is no dog whistle. When everyone can hear it, it's just a straight up whistle. This is Wing Commander Gibson of the Dam Busters taking his mutt for a walk and calling him fondly and loudly by name. Nor did Trump introduce Islamophobic profiling to America. Following 9/11, George W. Bush implemented the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, in which people from countries deemed higher risk were required to undergo interrogations and fingerprinting on entering the US. Some non-citizen male US residents over the age of 16 from countries with active militant threats were required to register in person at government offices and periodically check in. This was abandoned in 2011, 3 years into Obama's presidency. 4 years later, Congress passed an act that complicated visa applications for people from Iran, Iraq, Sudan, and Syria, and made it more difficult for anyone who'd visited any of those countries after 2011 to get visas. Somalia, Libya, and Yemen were added in 2016, making it the self-same list of 7 countries in Trump's executive order, with the self-same striking omissions: Saudi Arabia and Egypt, where the 9/11 bombers were mostly from. That was an act of Republican Congress, not an executive order from Obama. But Obama could have vetoed it, and he didn't. Now, I hope, obviously, what I'm not saying here is that Trump is as bad as Obama or even George W. Bush. What I'm not trying to do is establish equivalencies here, but I am keen to point out some continuities. Even if the pace and scale of what's happened is new, the broad trajectory has long been established. Trump's brazen attacks on minorities during the campaign and afterwards was new in that it simply refused to observe what was left of the racial etiquette in Republican messaging. So then the question remains, how did he win? Or at least, for the purposes of this talk, what role did race play in his victory? Once again, there are comforting explanations, particularly for liberals, who might assign his victory to racism alone. After all, Trump got almost 60% of the white vote and performed poorly among every other racial group. Race was clearly a central fault line, and how could it not be? In a country that practiced slavery for 200 years, apartheid for the next 100, and has only been a non-racial democracy for the last 50. But his victory can't be explained by racism alone. He won states that Obama won. He got votes. I met people. I spent most of the election in one town called Muncie in central Indiana and met several people who had voted for Obama once or even twice who were now thinking of voting for Trump. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, these are all states. North Carolina, Obama won once. The others, he won twice, where Trump won. So if it was just racism, not least given that in every one of those states, white people would have been a smaller percentage of the electorate than they were previously, then how would we explain that? I think the efforts to understand race and class separately result in one misunderstanding both entirely. Indeed, to get to the bottom of Trump's appeal, we will have to go beyond any monocausal interpretation and adopt a more intersectional approach, one that takes into account the fractious way a constellation of identities collide and align. People are, of course, many things: male, female, white, black, straight, gay, rural, college educated, and so on. And they are just one thing, themselves. And it's that whole person, not a segment of it, that goes to the polls, and that's what we need to understand. Hillary Clinton won women, but Trump won white women and older women. We get a clearer understanding, though, there was one woman in particular that I spoke to in Muncie, a white woman, Jamie Walsh, who explained to me why, having voted for Obama the first time, she was now thinking of voting for Trump. She had escaped Muncie because she feared drugs and single parenthood would suck her in a way that it had sucked in so many of her friends. And so she talked about the degree to which hearing the way that race was discussed made them resentful. And she said, you hear white privilege and you think money and opportunity, and we, white working class people, we don't have that. I understand how it works, but I don't think most people do. So when Trump says stuff, they can understand what he's saying, and he speaks to them in a way that other people don't. They feel stupid. They don't know what to say. And when you've got people calling them stupid and deplorable, well, how long do you think you can call people stupid and deplorable before they get bad? The link between economic anxiety and right-wing nationalism can be overdone, particularly when it comes to Trump. The easy narrative of a populist revolt has an appealing simplicity. But Clinton won votes from more than half of the people who earn less than $50,000 a year. The rich voted for Trump. Trump won the Electoral College and lost the popular vote. Thanks to the lowest turnout in 20 years, Trump won a lower percentage of the eligible vote than John Kerry, John McCain, Mitt Romney, and Gerald Ford, and they all lost. He got the same proportion of the white vote as Romney in 2012 and Bush in 2004, and only a little more than McCain in 2008. He may have led the charge to the right, but comparatively few marched with him. But nonetheless, that link cannot be denied. 8 years after a devastating financial crisis, where none of the architects of that crisis paid the price, people are looking for alternatives. They are desperate. The established political parties offer no real solution. Hillary Clinton effectively ran for Obama's third term. And while Obama might have won that, she could not. While Obama won 2 elections and increased the black turnout so that it even exceeded white turnout for the first time ever, when he was on the ballot, when he was not on the ballot in both midterms, Democrats suffered devastating losses as African Americans stayed at home. Many in black America and mainstream Democrats, uninspired by Hillary, simply didn't vote. Ambivalence opened the door and bigotry walked in. Now, the far right don't have any answers to these key questions of the economy either. Did you get, I think, a clearer understanding of Trump if we broaden our gaze beyond America? For in his style, Trump may be inimitably American. The hair, the orange, the whole thing. He couldn't be from anywhere else. But his messaging is far more global than he would certainly feel comfortable with as a nationalist. Most Western nations have a Trump. UKIP's Nigel Farage campaigned with him. Marine Le Pen, the leader of the Front National in France, was one of the first to congratulate him. Whether it's Geert Wilders in the Netherlands or the Vlaams Belang in Belgium or Viktor Orban in Hungary, each applies the same mixture of patriotic fervour, class grievance, racial animus and economic insecurity to their own national conditions. Jamie Walsh, once again, explained some of these anxieties. This whole PC thing, she said, racism, sexism, all these isms tell people they're ignorant, but people don't feel racist, they don't feel sexist. But nobody, she said, speaks up for the poor. There is systemic racism, but black people have advocates and poor white people don't. They're afraid. They're afraid that they're stupid. They don't feel racist. They don't feel sexist. They don't want to offend people or say the wrong thing. But white privilege for them is a blessing and a curse. Now, the link between this anxiety and right-wing nationalism can be overdone. The easy narrative of this popular revolt, as I've said, has an impelling simplicity. But if we do look beyond America, then you see the degree to which what Trump has done, in a sense, has perfected this messaging that is going on around the globe. In the absence of any serious strategy to protect democracy from global capital, the right resorts instead to the defense of culture, reinvented as tradition, elevated to heritage, and imagined as immutable. That's why, far from this being a defeat for identity politics of the left, anti-racism, feminism, religious plurality, all of those things that are understood to be identity politics, This would be far more accurately described as a victory for the identity politics of the right, whiteness, nationalism, and monoculturalism. Having evoked the myth of purity, it then targets the human pollutants, low-skilled immigrants, gypsies, Muslims, take your pick, people who wouldn't know a credit default swap if it ran up and kicked them out of their house, but who are as accessible and identifiable as neoliberal globalization, that force without a face and system without a center, is elusive. Minorities, writes Arjun Appadurai in Fear of Small Numbers, are the flashpoint for a series of uncertainties that mediate between everyday life and its fast-shifting global backdrop. This uncertainty, exacerbated by an inability of states to secure economic sovereignty in the era of globalization, can translate into a lack of tolerance of any sort of collective stranger. And this is how we get to a place, I think, for example, in Britain, where Brexit happens and it emboldens a group of people who then decide to, for example, attack Muslims or black people who are very unlikely to have come from Eastern Europe. But the collective other becomes a group that you can identify in any way you like. Similarly, 2 Indians shot, one shot dead, one injured just yesterday in America by a man who I think shouted, "Get out of our country," or something very similar. Indians have nothing to do with any of the terrorist attacks that America is fighting, but we're at a point where that doesn't matter to the assailant. They are identifiably globalized others. In Britain, we now have the audible other. There's the visible other, the people who you can see. There's the religious other, people who may dress in a certain way that codes their otherness. But now, to speak a foreign language in some British cities is enough to be beaten up, or killed, in fact. The targets of this intolerance shift according to the context. Roma in Hungary, Poles in Britain, Latinos in the US, and Muslims almost everywhere in the West. But the rhetoric and the true nature of the crisis remain constant. Parochial identities describe the protagonists, but it's global economics that shapes the narrative. It's not obvious to me that Trump's rise has created new racists. What I think it's done is embolden those who already exist. But in so doing, he has also energized an anti-racist opposition and may yet force a realignment of that opposition out of their ethnic and religious lagers into something more modern and effective. When it comes to racism in American politics, Trump didn't break the mold. He has adapted and expanded it. What we have now in terms of America's racial polity is still unprecedented, but it is not entirely unfamiliar. What Trump is doing, and here I will end, is saying what was previously believed to be the unsayable. Now, however liberating that may sound, what that does is then unleash people to do what was previously understood to be the undoable, to open up on 2 Indians at a gas station, to shout at people in the street. There are now immigration raids in major cities. And it's this emboldening of American racism that is the terrifying thing about the Trump presidency. It was always there. Any visit to any major American city will tell you, will show you that it was there. And if you couldn't see it with your own eyes, you could read it in the statistics that the life expectancy of an African American man in Washington, D.C. is lower than the life expectancy of a man on the Gaza Strip. black infant mortality in Chicago, where I lived, was on a par with infant mortality on the West Bank. So Trump did not invent American racism. What he has done is exposed it, emboldened it, and now we're going to see the degree to which the popular, not the legal checks and balances, but the popular checks and balances are able to confront it. Thank you.